Dun, 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 dun. Ba-bong! Hi guys, and welcome to a new episode on this channel. Today we'll be talking about this book called, actually a little early, this book called Martin Luther King Jr. Now what does this book even talks about? Well, this book talks about Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, and it says here in the Dear Reader section that she was 8 years old when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. died. It also says that she was too young to understand fully what had happened, but she knew that she was old enough to know that her country had lost a great leader. Now, the author's name is Laurie Calkhoven, and she was pretty good at writing all of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. And she was able to write it from all the way from the family of ministers, like his family, literally his father and grandfather were all ministers of a nearby church, to all the way until he was dead. And also how we keep his legacy alive. And now I want to tell you about all those stuff. Now, first of all, as I said earlier, family of ministers. Martin Luther King's family was all ministers. Like, only his father and grandfather were ministers, and his mother was the teacher. And later, Martin Luther King Jr. would later be a minister and used his things. He first wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer to help change the world, but then he decided being a minister could help change the world as much as a doctor or a lawyer. And all that stuff. Then later we go into segregation. Whites only and all that stuff. Now, what is segregation? Well, segregation is a practice that separates whites from blacks, and we're pretty unequal. The whites said that segregation was separate but equal. That doesn't even make any sense. Now, I literally heard this story once from Rosa Parks that she saw colored water came out in different streams of colors, but it didn't. That stuff. And then the clear path. And then Martin Luther King went on to university, and then he met Coretta Parks. Coretta. And then later Coretta will become Coretta King, and they married to. And then finally, we get to the chapter where Rosa Parks comes in. Now, this is when Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat for a white man. And then this movement, that spreads out. That news spreads out. And then Martin Luther King Jr. organizes a bus boycott. And it lasts. You guess first, write that in the comments below. First, write that. And it lasts for 385 days. That's a whopping over a year. And it started from 1955 to 1956. December 5th to December 20th. Then, well, in the boycott, Martin Luther King, and he also did other protests peacefully. And why did he do it peacefully? Well, he learned all of these peaceful protests from a guy named Mohandas Gandhi. Yeah, that's that. And Gandhi used these non-violent ways to do a protest against the British government, which colonized him. And until he was assassinated, Martin Luther King was like, yay! But then when he died, it was like, oh man, and all that stuff. And then he was arrested for doing all these peaceful protests, which doesn't make any sense, does it? A letter from Birmingham. This letter from Birmingham. And then, well, Martin Luther King was arrested, but then he wrote a letter. And fun fact, those letters were written on newspapers smuggled into his cell, even his own toilet paper. He also had a pen smuggled in with the newspaper. So he wrote a letter from Birmingham. He even wrote a letter. And then, finally, we get to the point where his most famous thing that happens here. In chapter 8, he makes his I have a dream speech. And his words are so powerful. It can even like give you the goosebumps. I really should have listened to audio of his. So I have a dream, and then he ended it, and then another speech he came. He came with another speech, and that was his very very last speech, and he ended it with this: "Free at last, free at last. Thank the God for being free at last." And then. And this was when he was giving it to a crowd of protesters, of workers. And then when he was coming out of his hotel room at the 306 place, room 306, this room right here, he was shot by a criminal in white. Now, his assassinator was James Earl Ray, and right after he killed Martin, he fled the country, and all the way to England. Let's see what will happen if we touch the globe. Where did Earl Ray go? England, sir, England. Yeah, well, that's all that. I'm just using a robot voice, alright. Now, Earl Ray was, after 2 months after he killed Martin Luther, he was arrested, and he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. And by that time, I guess he would be dead. By that time, he'll die in prison. So yeah. And then Coretta King Scott. Well, was alive in 2006 and worked until she died and continued Martin's work. And she was also said to be good with children's books. And then the Coretta Scott King Book Award was released. This new award was given to the best authors or illustrators of the whole year. And the winners will always be announced on January, the same month that the national holiday of Martin Luther King Jr. was celebrated. So yeah. This was a pretty good honor for a medal to be named after Coretta King Scott. And I have other books about Martin Luther King Jr., like this one of Martin Luther King Jr. in the Baptist Church. That he made his lectures and his speech. I'm pretty sure this is the last one he'll make. And then this one, his most famous speech, I Have a Dream speech. This cover is about his I Have a Dream speech. And look how big his head is, though. And look at all the people around here. And that was what really happened during the I Have a Dream speech that Martin Luther King Jr. made. And this was another speech that Martin Luther King Jr. made. Now, if you're asking, like, you love photographing, well, you're asking Martin Luther King Jr. He was also said to be the best photographed person in all time, in his time. And he was photographed mostly when he was doing speeches, like, I have a dream, and all that stuff. So yeah, that's basically it. And you can learn something from his life. Even though he was never able to complete all of his works, he was able to give protesters and workers enough courage to keep his legacy going and keep his work on. And you might be one of those people who will change the world too, and change the world that Martin Luther King Jr. wanted it. So yeah. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, we should not be divided by color of our skin. It should be divided by character, as it should have always been. And that's the end of Martin Luther King Jr. He died very young, when he was 39 years old, so yeah. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you in the next episode. Shinhan out. Peace!